So first of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Shen-Hammer, for taking the time to come on and share your ideas and your thoughts. For those that are not aware, don't know, Dr. Shen-Hammer is like, he's a pioneer, and he's been a prolific writer in our profession. He went to med school before majority of you that are watching this were ever born. I think he even started studying Chinese medicine in the 70s, where before most of you weren't even born. And I know I was introduced to Leon through my good friend and late good friend, Ray Rubio, who said, I need to meet this man. And Ray had studied a bit with Dr. John Shen, who was Shen-Hammer's mentor. And Leon and I have had discussions through the years, and I always enjoy, when I speak with you, Leon, there's two people in the room for me. One is the health practitioner, so I'm just soaking in what you have to share and say about the medicine that I find very profound. And two is, I have such fond memories of talking to my Zeta, my grandfather, when he was in his 90s. And you look a bit like him, quite a bit actually. So I feel like I'm with him when we have these conversations, which is why sometimes we stay on for hours if you have the energy for it, because I have that experience when we talk. So I'm here as a grandson, and I'm here as a Chinese medicine practitioner to listen to what you have to share. Leon's latest book, he's written so many books. He started the Dragon Rises, his book Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies, the Dragon Rises College in Florida. And then I was given the honor to read this when it was draft, and I was so surprised and happy that my little quote was put on the back of your book with some other great minds. And when I read this a while back, it touched me because I feel there's a paradigm shift happening. And in your book, it kind of answers so many questions I had. And the only thing I really want to do is go move to Florida and attend your school so I can learn Chinese medicine the way you guys teach it there. And so I just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for writing the first of many series. This is volume 1, everybody, and volume 2 will be published maybe by the time we even have this recording out, but it should be available in 2019. And you can read Leon's bio. I just wanted to share with you that this man was a psychiatrist, a medical doctor, a prolific writer, and he learned from Dr. John Shen, and he has helped evolve this medicine to work in the modern day. And he respects the roots, the classics. However, he's open to new information so it can be applied to the human being as we live today with our drugs and chemicals and our stresses. So, Leon, I'll start with the first question, just kind of for you, because your time, is precious. You're a busy man writing all these papers. What was the purpose for you to have this discussion? Because I know you're still a man on a mission at the age of 94. So what was the purpose of our discussion today for you that motivated you to make the time to get on technology?
Well, before I answer that question, Lon, I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak to the Chinese medical community and about Chinese medicines. And more or less, you communicated the message that this has been my life's work, that has been what they call my bliss, my love. And so I will try and answer your questions, but thank you. So let me just say one thing preliminary before. Last night, on schedule, my computer melted down, and that's something to anticipate anytime I need it. So some of the material may be lost, and I'll try to retrieve it as I go along. My purpose, or the object today, is to inform you of the existence and purpose of the Contemporary Oriental Medical Foundation and the content thereof, called COM, that's C, capital C-O-M, stands for Contemporary Chinese Medicine. This is my job this afternoon, and at any rate, your job this afternoon is to stay awake. So I'm not sure. I think your job is going to be harder than mine. Since because of my age, I'm forced to read this message, as I mentioned, probably. And so I've already stated what your job is and what mine is. I would like to add, in terms of everything, Lauren was so kind in his introduction, is that as a result of doing this, I have learned a lot. And basically what I've learned in this presentation is what is missing. I realize that there are gaps here that need to be filled for this audience, for it to be meaningful and complete, which I didn't know before I began. So what is the purpose of Contemporary Oriental Medicine Foundation is to preserve and advance the Chinese medical writings, my writings, which Lauren referred to, and it's known collectively again as Contemporary Oriental Medicine. The next question, which is, maybe I should state it, what is it that is to be preserved and advanced? This work, as Lauren implied, is expressed in 7 books, around 40 published articles, many DVDs, and a number of YouTube segments, lessons on comfoundation.org, which incidentally is the way in which you can access the foundation's website. Hundreds of other articles, I'm even impressed by them myself, and the Dragon Rises of College of Oriental Medicine, to which Lauren referred and is now celebrating its 18th year. So, what subjects are addressed in this work? The above work covers all aspects of the medicine. The single most important aspect that distinguishes it from is the emphasis on 2 things. One are these concepts, and the second one, and principally, on diagnosis. This has been my fate, whatever reason, and I do believe in fate. That has been my work. Typically, in a speech like this, at the end of it, somebody will get up in the audience and say, oh, okay, this is all fine, but where do you put the needle? So I'm not sure I can answer that question today, but we'll see what happens. Now the concepts, I forget how large the book is. I have it here and I should look. And it's 300 and some pages. 361 or 62 pages. And so it obviously covers a fair part of the medicine. There are, in a sense, concepts, but there are ways of looking at different aspects of the medicine that, in my opinion, are more valuable than what we've learned from TCM. So, as I say, it's a philosophy of the medicine, but it goes well beyond there. And there are 193 separate concepts. They're not many of them are, some of them are mentioned in the book, that are new to the medicine. And medicine that we know as TCM, some of which I am told appear in the classics. I plan to discuss perhaps two today, the first of which I consider the most important. My teacher, Dr. John Shen, who I met in 1974, taught me the first concept that led to the remainder. He actually, in terms of what's in that book, I have alluded to him where he has made a contribution. But most of what's in the book has just evolved from my involvement with the medicine and from working with patients. But at any rate, he taught and practiced something that is relatively rare, and that is to think for oneself. He said that the great teachers of the past were simply human, like us, and made mistakes. And throughout the time that I was with him, and I spent 8 years, with him 2 or 3 days a week for seeing about 30 patients a day. But during all the 27 years that we were associated with each other, the expression "book wrong" was frequently heard. So I'm not sure, I can't attribute anything directly to anybody, not even my parents, only maybe to God. But he had a profound effect on me, and if you look in the introduction to one of Ted Kapchuk's later books, you will see that he says that Dr. Shen was the person who had the greatest influence on him in his professional life. In my first 4 years in Chinese medicine, 71 to 74, I studied with an excellent practitioner and thinker, J.D. Van Buren, where I learned some of the areas he personally developed, what he called the extra channels or extra meridians, and which was the subject of my first published article in the American Journal of Acupuncture in 1980, and that I personally preferred to call homeostatic channels, because in studying them, I found that that is their principal purpose. They are like the ocean, the channels are like the rivers, and whatever goes wrong in the rivers, the water from the ocean can restore. I also encountered at the same time, working with Dr. Van Buren, something called the Law of Correspondences. And I think you're all familiar with that. That law teaches that the heart is associated with joy, actually mania in psychology, the liver with anger, the lungs, I'm sorry, not in psychology, in pathology, the anger, liver with anger, the lungs with sorrow, the kidneys with fear, and the spleen with compassion. That's what I learned in those first 4 years. While I could understand and appreciate the relationship, I wondered to myself, each of these organ concepts, the liver, the heart, and so on, represented so much more that could be summed up as chi, and sort of represent the totality of existence, even in the Law of Correspondences. Reducing them psychologically to such a simplistic formulation seemed an enormous evasion of a complex issue. Human Psychology. I created a chart at that time, in 1975, that moved in the direction of addressing what was missing. I kept that chart, and based on it, I wrote over the 1980s the first of what was intended to be a series of books on the subject of psychology and Chinese medicine, and a book called Dragon Rises, Red Bird Flies. And I would direct you particularly to chapter 7 through 13, where I particularly address this issue. And the reason I do that is because this was early on in the American association with Chinese medicine. The first few chapters are kind of introductory things that most people, including all of you, are intimately familiar with, but there are also some ideas in there, especially in terms of how Western psychology is much more congenial to Chinese medicine than it is to Western medicine, which has never really addressed it. Keeps trying, but doesn't succeed. At that time in 1990, as this is when it was published, I was beginning to work on the second book in this series of Dragon Rises, Red Bird Flies, and I came across notes from my time with Dr. Shen. As I said, 8 years, 2 or 3 days a week, about 30 patients a day, sitting with him with the original and continued intention of his teaching me the pulse. And that was not easy work. He was rather resistant at first. I began to study these notes, and 3 years later, I had written an 800-page book on the pulse, on pulse diagnosis, that was published in another 8 years, and again 12 years. And eventually was abbreviated into a 400-page handbook. This pulse system was a secret system handed down from father to son for at least 400 years, with the Menghe Ding Fui lineage. And finally, the last to carry it forward was Ding Ji Wan, and this was to Dr. Shen and a few other very wealthy students. That was a requirement. Several of whom, unfortunately, were killed by the Japanese invaders of Hong Kong in 1942. Dr. Shen escaped. Now, there are references to this arcane public pulse system mentioned in Volker Scheid's book. And I'm sorry, I don't have it with me right this point, and I meant to. And I think you're probably all familiar with the name. And at a later point, I will share the pages that I'm referring to with Lauren, if he's interested, and he can transmit them. But there are references to a secret pulse system, as I said, just handed down from father to son, never shared with anybody else. And that was in keeping with the Chinese system, which secrets were kept within the clan for survival purposes. In other words, if you had something that was maybe different from somebody else, you could sell it. And that gave you a leg up in whatever you were doing, and certainly in the medicine. Now, let's just fast forward to 2001. when my wife and I, with two colleagues, began Dragon Rice's College of Oriental Medicine. I was very reluctant all my life to become associated with any institution, and I resisted that one. And both my wife and I went to a retreat center, and we more or less were informed that we should do this. So we went back from South Carolina to Florida, and with two other colleagues, we began Dragon Rice's College of Oriental Medicine. Now, I was the medical director, and it was necessary for me to develop a curriculum for the students in this school, for the asking, listening, looking, and touching diagnosis. With regard to the touching, I developed a system. But this ultimately has become known as what I referred to earlier as COM, or Contemporary Oriental Medicine, which includes all of the above, all the concepts. And the concept book was published in 2017. As for the touching part, I had contributed the pulse system that I've referred to, and of course had to learn and teach and get other people to teach other aspects of the touching. As for the asking and listening, I took that on myself. The looking segment of diagnosis, I have a great many notes on from Dr. Shen, which have never been developed. And hopefully I'll live long enough to do that. It's very rich. Now the last book in the series, Contemporary Oriental Medicine, is called Methodology. And that describes in great detail the asking and listening, as I just mentioned. Diagnosis is the result or resulting formulation that comes from all the material from asking and listening, that is taking all the symptoms and translating them into Chinese medical what's the word I'm looking for? Help. Conditions. Thank you. And from that and other ways of organizing this material, we lead to a formulation, and which is planning, and implementation, which is the execution, methodology of diagnosis and treatment. And that includes follow-up. Now, this, to the next part, some of the material that was lost that I'm trying to reproduce. The purpose of the second book is to help practitioners gain a deep understanding of each patient and his situation, and to allow them to share that understanding in a way that engenders awareness, change, and change in the patients themselves. So let me explain. All this work, that is, the intake I've just mentioned, the asking, listening, and the execution, formulation, and implementation, this takes a lot of time, as well as a thorough pulse diagnosis if you're going to be writing down all your findings. At this point, and Dr. Shen never took more than 10 or 15 minutes. I can do it in that time. provided I don't need to record it. But if I do need to record it, it takes a lot of time, and we have forms that one can follow. But together with the pulse diagnosis, with the asking and listening and the resulting material that I've just mentioned, I would say it would take me about 2.5 hours. So obviously one cannot do this each time it sees a patient, which for me was always at least an hour. And I know for other people, it's a lot less, half hour, some people 15 minutes. That's all beyond me. So my suggestion and what I did was to, in my initial contact with the patient, I would explain to them that I was going to take 2.5 hours, and that during that time I may or may not do some treatments. But since most of the patients I saw were suffering from chronic diseases and had been to many, many different types of physicians and with no significant improvement. And so I had a pretty good argument. I said, stick with me for 2.5 hours the first time we see each other. I may or may not treat you. But the next time I see you, and I will have done this work, which I did on Mondays, if that means anything. And I'll give you a detailed summary of my impressions based on those 2.5 hours of work. And that worked. I never had to do such a thorough examination again, except periodically, depending on the patient. If I felt I wasn't getting anywhere, I would suggest to them that we have a second look. So I just wanted to say that to begin with, in case everybody feels, how can we possibly do all this each time I see a patient? It's not necessary. The purpose of the second book, as I said, is to gain a deep understanding of each patient and his situation, and to allow them to share that understanding in a way that engenders awareness, change in the patients themselves. In the first part of the execution, implementation that I mentioned above, of that diagnostic work, the first part has to do with referrals and things that the patient can do for themselves. And of course, that involves, to a very great extent, lifestyle, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And, things within that framework of lifestyle, like diet, nutrition, those aspects of the patient's life is the first thing that I address. That was the ultimate goal of this book, that through a deeper consciousness of both the practitioner and the patient, they may work together to negotiate a pathway that allows the patient the kind of growth that results in true healing. I think the important thing for the patient to ultimately get from this kind of investigation is what it is they are doing in their life that is creating their problem. Because as Dr. Shen said over and over again, Chinese medicine in the life. That's the way he spoke. And that is the truth. And it's not only important for people to get some kind of an idea of how they're involved, but in some detail, but what their contribution through their lifestyle, which we'll talk about a little bit later if we have time, to their condition. And ultimately, that is the only way that any kind of lasting healing takes place. So that's the deal, what our part is, and ultimately what their part is. But your part, our part, is continuous. We have to support people in making changes, which are difficult. We all have to do them in our life. You know how difficult it is. I know how difficult it is. People need support. People come up with all kinds of amazing answers that they themselves never thought about until the question was asked. And the relevance to their condition is not insignificant, even at that point. So yes, that's, I would just add one other thing that I will bring up maybe later. Early in my career as a psychoanalyst, and when I was in training, and I was in a psychoanalytic institute for 7 years before they let me out on good behavior. I had some wonderful teachers. One of them was Eric Fromm, who you may or may not have heard of. And what one of them taught me was that you don't listen necessarily to what the patient is saying. Of course, you do listen, but you're more interested in what they're avoiding. And so as you listen to your patients, think to yourself, what is it that they are not saying? I mean, in psychiatry, when I practiced, naturally people were talking about their mothers and fathers, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, etc., to a reasonable extent. And people typically came in, and all the emphasis was on how horrible their father was or how horrible their mother was, and never really referring to the other parent or other people in the environment. And so ultimately that was the issue, is what they were avoiding. And the other thing to listen to is what do they want? Because a lot of people are talking, but basically it's all revolves about something they really want. And that's another thing to listen for, with what I call the third ear. And in teaching, meeting people and learning about them and helping them learn about themselves in whatever medicine, that's one of the things that is important to introduce to the prospective student, is the idea that there are it's not my original term, what's called the third ear. In other words, there's something about what they're doing or saying that suggests something that isn't concrete, but it gives you an impression. And it's very important to pay attention to that third ear and third eye. Because people are doing things while they're talking that very often undo what they're saying. And I could give you examples if I could see you. I've had people telling me things, and with their hands, going like this to the side. So, but that's very important, and very important for me when I was teaching. important for my work and important in the teaching. So I may have already said this, and I'm probably repeating myself. I'm best known for just one aspect of this work, though all of it is part of my passion, and that's the pulse system. And that's never really been, for a while, significantly taught in this country, except in certain places where it's very important, places like Portland, Oregon, in the East Coast. But, and okay, I've already forgotten what I started to say. But it is now being taught extensively in China. And when I say extensively, you have to put that in perspective. I mean, we have about 500 students in China out of 1,500,000,000 people. So, judge for yourself how significant that is. Nevertheless, it's growing. And also being introduced through what they call WeChat are some of the ideas in my books. So, but it's also in Europe. There's a group in Europe that's been there for quite a while, very highly developed. There's a very important group in Portland, Oregon, I may have already mentioned. Yes. So it is being taught in many parts of the world, and it is important to me. Now, I mentioned the fact that Calm consists of everything I've been saying, plus these 192 concepts that I told are new to TCM, but that some of them appear in the classics. So is there one subject I would like to care to focus on today to illustrate the nature of calm? Well, I'm not so sure I did a good job on that, but I will try. And it's a very thorny challenge in Chinese medicine. It's called the separation of yin and yang, or in Dr. Shen's terms, the qi is wild. And frankly, I wonder if anybody in the audience is familiar with those terms. But for a greater clarification of those ideas, and they're frequently mentioned in the book concepts, but I think they're more fully discussed in those two books on the pulse. That's a separation of yin and yang, or Dr. Shen called it the qi is wild, or just the qi is wild. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. Obviously, it's too large a subject to cover, but it also involves things that you are familiar with, like essence, gene deficiency. Now, briefly, the qi is wild, or qi wild, San, S-A-N-M-A-I, in Pinyin, is a condition of extreme functional deficiency in which, for one reason or another, the yin and yang have separated, lost operative contact, and are thus unable to support each other. There have been other names for it, and I'll just pass by now. But one way of thinking of yin, the material energy of the universe, maybe the dark energy that astronomers refer to, is as a gravitational force that holds or grasps the more effervescent yang energies. Should the yin become drained, however, it can no longer hold the yang. Instead, the lighter yang energies, functional energies, wander aimlessly to all parts of the organism. And what the yang does is it brings function. And so if it is wandering all parts of the organism and not going to where it's most effective, then there's a lot of disorganization without that organizing force of the yin. And the result is, as I said, physiological disarray, which the ordinary has. I've already referred to this. Qi wild is thus a condition characterized by chaos, representing the most serious physiological disruptions and disorganizations. The Qi wild patient is highly vulnerable to serious and fast-spreading events, life-threatening ones, and within a very relatively short time. Now, a typical one, in terms of like, how can somebody who doesn't have the pulse at their disposal, which is most of you, or all of you, how can you diagnose this chaos? The Qi is wild, the separation of yin and yang. And when I mentioned in the beginning that I realized something important was missing from this talk, I was referring generally to that. And so really all I can contribute at this point in answer to that question is really disease. Very, if you have a patient, especially one who, for no reason, at a very young age, develops a very serious life-threatening illness, most likely it's what I'm referring to as the Qi. Qi is wild. The one that you're all familiar with is cancer. Cancer is typically chaos and is expressly the Qi is wild. Mental illness is another form of this chaos. It's especially disruptive to the nervous system. And I won't go into that in more detail. So let's talk briefly about essence and essence deficiency, Jing. You like to call it Jing, I like to call it essence. Because I'm American and why pretend that I'm Chinese. So whatever you want to call it, it's the original ground life force substance function of life from which all other force substances differentiate in utero and outside. We speak of that differentiation in Chinese medicine in its most comprehensive sense as yin and yang, but in more detailed existence as solid hollow organs and the function or substance of those organs, Qi, blood, yin, yang, and the pathogenic factors that affect it. This is all in TCM. Wind, cold, damp, heat, fire, dry. And of course, what we were talking about before, sadness, anger, joy, mania, fear, worry, overthinking, shock. At some point, I should have mentioned that, let's say, we just take excessive compassion, which is associated with the spleen. I mean, as an example of how oversimplified that concept is, in Dragon Rise's Redbird Flies, if you look under the earth, forget the number of the chapter, you will find many pages on that subject, not just one word. And they're all appropriate. So essence is controlled and stored by the kidneys and the marrow. I think you all know this, don't need me to tell you. And the bone marrow, where it produces most of the leukocytes and at least half of the red blood cells. It's delivered and harmonized into the larger physiology by the triple burner, through the channels and to and from the fire of Mingmen. All of that is not necessarily relevant here. And you probably know as much or more about it as I do. It is said that one is born with a certain amount of essence, commensurate with generic endowment, excessive life in utero, stored by the kidneys, and available as needed by the solid hollow organs and other functions. All this, you don't need me to tell you. Now, as I said before, parts of this speech disappeared and I stuffed them into other parts, I guess. But in terms of the qi being wild, this has increased exponentially since I've worked with Dr. Shen. And the question is, why? Qualities have appeared on the pulse, either never before encountered. We call one of them is leather hard, not important here. As I've also mentioned already, that the qi of wild has increased dramatically in recent years. And some pulse qualities, which are referred to in earlier pulse systems, like Qi Chen, Wang Shuhe, that were considered relatively rare at that time, are now becoming increasingly common, like the choppy quality. So why? Now, we're all familiar with the fact that with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, life has been speeding up enormously. One hopefully brief reference to that is earlier in my life, I lived in a rural community of fishermen and potato farmers. And the fishermen and the potato farmers taught me a great deal. They taught me a lot about ecology. This is years before I encountered Chinese medicine. They taught me about the relationship of everything in these harbors and to life in the ocean. 80% of the fish in the ocean, sorry, I forgot the word, but they start their life in these estuaries. And so I think I began to get the idea of what we know about in Chinese medicine, the relationships between things like you have in the wuxi, the five elements, and how they relate to each other. That idea started back then. And Milt told me a story. Milt Miller was was the principal person. He was uneducated, as far as we know, but a brilliant man and a real leader. And he told me a story, and I don't know if it's necessary to relate that story, but it's hard for me not to. When Milt was he learned how to fish. These were baymen, fishing in the bay, not out in the ocean. He learned how to fish from his uncle. And he would go out with him in the morning, stay there for the day, and then come back. Now, his uncle would sleep as long as he wanted. Whenever he woke up, he would have his breakfast, go down, hitch up the horse to the buggy, and he would get into the buggy and go back to sleep. The horse knew the way and took him down to the pier where his boat was. He woke up whenever he felt it was, appropriate, no particular time, and got out, unhitched the horse, and then got in his boat with Milt and went fishing. When he came back at the end of the day, he got back in his buggy and closed his eye. Hitched the horse to the buggy and closed his eyes and went back to sleep. And the horse took him home. And that was his very exciting life. Then one day, Milt was young, and this is in the early 20s, bought a Model T Ford. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the Model T Ford. I was born around that time. But, it would go 20, 25 miles an hour and then begin to rattle and shake. And so he suggested to his uncle, he said, why don't I pick you up tomorrow morning? And so he arrived in a Model T Ford, and he invited his uncle in, who got in and made himself comfortable, and off Milt went down to the pier in his Model T Ford at about 20 miles an hour. And then after a relatively short time, he felt a very sharp poking in his ribs. And so he stopped the car and he said to his uncle, what's the problem? And his uncle turned to him and said, hey, Milt, he said, what's the rush? At 20 miles an hour. So think of your life now and the life of your patients compared to that, and just imagine what has done to you. Now that's increasing. And I could give you lots of examples from my own life where, life has entirely changed in the 94 years that I've been around. Now, you could probably give me some good examples of that as well. Now, consider all the other stresses that are on us and on our patients. Increasingly. And as I said before, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and now the Information Revolution. And that especially involves toxicity from radiation and the endless chemicals in our environment. And of course, you're all familiar with global warming, but that's a big issue. We won't pursue at this point. Of these latter, just as an example, microtoxins, short and long chain hydrocarbons, receptors, from the manufacture of plastics, which really began after World War II and picked up in the 1960s. And now, as you know, is clogging all our rivers, harbors, and the ocean. And all this is manufactured from oil. Now, it turns out that, as I said, these long and short chain hydrocarbons, which are invisible, but are byproducts of that manufacturing, are found in all of us, and you out there, and me in here. And what they have discovered is that they attach themselves to hormone receptors. So the assault on life is endless. One important result is the essence deficiency, and the separation of yin and yang, and the chi is wild. And incidentally, with regard to those hormone receptors, I don't know if you've noticed, but it's been very clear to me over the years, and I think I've been in this field for almost 50 years, that people are getting larger and larger. I follow tennis. I used to play a lot, and I enjoyed watching it. My tennis heroes were Andre Agassi was 5'11". His tormentor, Sampras, was 6'1", and they were considered pretty big. And today, some of the champions, like Dvorak, who is 6'3", and some of the others, there's at least 6'3", 6'2", 6'4". But the new guys coming in are 6'6", 6'8", 6'10", and 7 feet. As far as I know, there's going to be no contest. And all of this is a result of the massive amounts of chemical toxins being poured into our fields, into our water, and from the other things that I have just mentioned. And only God knows the extent of it. But as I started to say, one result is the chi is wild, essence deficiency. In subtle ways, and we actually, in our organism, we have limited ways of dealing with this. They were very effective. Things like pushing emotional problems off into low channels and physical ones that we couldn't deal with into the divergent channels, and particularly in the San Chow, with the San Chow, to cope. But we have gone way beyond what these things were designed for when human beings were created 200,000 years ago. At any rate, what's the point of talking about all this? The point is, this is what you, in your lifetime, in your practice, in your work, have to deal with. And you have to address it. You have to do what you can, not only in your everyday practice, but you're going to have to do something about trying to control this radiation, control these toxins. It's all impacting you every single day and your patients.
In clinic, I've moved my focus away from, I educate them about the Wi-Fi and the chemicals. However, I know that's just another stress for my patients to obsess about. So I work on focusing more on the negative thoughts, the subconscious beliefs, and bringing that to the surface, because at least they can work on changing those. They are fully in control of changing those, where the ozone and the Wi-Fi, they can't. So I tend to not focus on that as much.
Well, it may be because I grew up in New York City in the 30s during the Depression. And your consciousness in terms of what was going on in the world at that time and what kind of a stand you would take was, relevant. Maybe it's, irrelevant now. My son asked me how I converted my practice from one that was strictly psychiatry, psychoanalysis. It was interesting that I was always looking, because very early on it occurred to me that all healing throughout history came from the laying on of hands. So very early in my career, I kept looking for a way in which I could talk to people and listen, and at the same time touch. And I couldn't find a satisfactory one until I came to Chinese medicine. So he asked me that question, how did I make this change, which was rather sudden. And I said, well, I never changed. I just kept on doing what I was always doing, and just did something with my hands, laying on of hands. And so that's what you're referring to, really. You're sensitive to what your patient can do for themselves, and not burdening them with things that are beyond any one individual's power. But there is, an issue for all of us. And you live in Canada. I don't know about the audience, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but we have a situation where the world got together, and even though not necessarily always keeping to it, they agreed that there was such a thing as global warming, and that each country took the responsibility to do something about it, including the United States, until 2 years ago, at which point the United States has not recognized global warming as a reality. So,
Leon, if I took the pulse of the United States, I would say she is wild.
Yes, I agree with you.
The yin and yang is separating.
Maybe that should be where we end. So.
I want to share a few quotes from your book and then maybe you can do like a closing statement. But some things that just stuck to me when I was going through your book. And so, I just wanted to share. But the sense I got from our discussions and from your book is you want to make Chinese medicine more relevant and valuable, and so that it really continues to work in our time in the future. And a lot of us have been trained as, I call it barefoot doctors, but there's a bit of essence missing from it. And this is why you've created this series of books, Contemporary Oriental Medicine Concepts, and why Dragon Rises still thrives. Your college still in Florida has that purpose. some people say, you know, well, the classics are everything. I loved when I was reading some of the forwards and the stuff in the book, in your book about the classics are essential for staying rooted in the medicine. But we still need new thinking essential for growth and relevance, because some people like to say, well, it's in the classics, so we can't leave the classics. It has to be this way. And I like your approach of, to me, it's yin-yang balance, where no, we respect and we learn the classics so we can stay rooted, and we continue to learn for growth and relevance. And so that's another piece that I pulled from your book. I think the purpose that you have now, so this is me, my interpretation is you want us to raise the level of us as practitioners. So if we do just the zong fu, take these symptoms and put them into syndromes, my interpretation is what we're doing now is what you call acupuncture technician, which will help some people, but it's kind of a low level of the medicine. In your books, in your college, the goal is to create superior Chinese medicine physicians, so we can really get to the core and let these people have health transformations. And then just another quote, Leon, and then I would love you to kind of summarize and we'll close up. This quote has always stuck with me, and when I have a challenging patient, this is what I think about. And so to quote you, remember that the difficult patient has not chosen you as his victim. It is what makes them difficult that you are chosen to heal. And I really found that a beautiful quote that I have to repeat. And for those that find reading all these books is a lot of work, or going to his college, well, reading them is much easier than writing them. So thank you for writing them. But another quote that you have is, nothing worthwhile is easy. I always say free has no value in my book that you read. So yes, nothing worthwhile is easy. So it may take a little effort to take yourself from acupuncture technician to Chinese medicine physician. Any closing statements, Leon, that you would like to share with the audience would be greatly appreciated. And again, thank you for your time.
I think you have summed it up better than I can. In terms of things I was going to talk about a little bit more was lifestyle, and we've already referred to that. I was going to talk about something that's, I think, very important in our time and important to practitioners at the moment. And you and I have maybe been on opposite sides of this. And that is the fact that along with all these other changes, what's happening is that older men are divorcing their wives and marrying younger women and beginning a second family. And if you consider the consequences, when a man's sperm at the age of 35 is only 1/3 or 1/4 actually as vigorous as a man of 25, the consequences are unfortunately defective children whose lives, as well as that of their parents, are profoundly negatively affected with problems such as the autism spectrum. So I did want to leave that. That's maybe a thorn in the side of my benefactor. And I think as far as any other thing to say in summary, I think you have.
Well, to address the fertility, I personally agree. We're talking what you mentioned earlier, Jing or essence, and that if the male is not healthy and the female is not healthy, then we set up a blueprint, health blueprint for this child that's not optimal. And so there's two things here. One is people having children when they're healthier and with youth on their side. And then for patients that we see, one of my mentors, because the question was the judgment, like maybe this couple's too old, should they be having children? Is it fair to the child? And my mentor, Randine, had said, well, they're going to have that child with or without you. So maybe your role is to give that child its best chance. So rather than just going into the IV in vitro fertilization, because they're doing it anyhow, do whatever you can to help them reach their peak potential, fertility potential. But yes, the answer is if they had met at 20, it would be much better for that child to have been born at the age of 20 physically than at the parents at 45. So I agree with you. And men aren't involved still in their health. It's still the women coming in, even if it's male factor. It's quite unfortunate, but up to this date, most of the emphasis is on the female and not giving enough importance to what the man is contributing to the health of the child.
Well, that's true, and you know, just between us, I mean, in nature, males generally, you know, every spring or twice a year, compete to the death to have the opportunity to procreate, and the women stand around and watch and choose the male who succeeds in killing off all the others. And they are going to pick the male who is going to give their offspring the best chance of surviving and thriving. And we're not letting that happen.
No, we're not.
So anyway, I think I appreciate what you just told me, and I agree with your mentor, and I would definitely add that to the mix. And I want to thank you in particular and all other people who are still listening for this opportunity. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Leon-Hammer, thank you. And I hope we can do a few more of these. I know you got several volumes. Volume 2 is almost out or probably is out for those that are watching this as a recording. The Contemporary Oriental Medicine Concept. This is volume 1. There'll be a volume 2. So as long as you're willing and able and interested, we can do a few more. Maybe in February we'll record another one and keep letting you share some information.
I'm never going to retire. Oh well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.